The morning Saoirse Brennan arrived in Coldwater Flats. The temperature had already dropped to the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your plans feel foolish. She had $2.40 in her coat pocket, a carpetbag with a broken clasp held shut by a length of twine, and a letter from a man she'd never met that read more like a list of requirements than an introduction. Must be capable of hard work, must not expect comforts, must understand that this arrangement is practical in nature and nothing more. The letter was signed Calloway Vane, and beneath his name someone had added in different ink, in smaller, more careful handwriting, "The children are good, they just need someone steady." Saoirse had read that postscript so many times on the train from Toronto that she'd worn a crease into the paper. She didn't know if Vane had written it himself, second-guessing his cold phrasing, or if someone else had added it as an afterthought, some well-meaning neighbor trying to sweeten a deal that didn't deserve sweetening. Either way, it was the only part of the letter that had made her say yes. She'd needed a reason. Any reason. The station at Coldwater Flats was a single room with a wood stove that wasn't lit, and a station master who barely looked up from his newspaper when she came through the door. Outside, the platform was empty. The train had already pulled away, taking with it the last familiar sound she could hold on to. Saoirse stood in the cold and waited. He arrived 20 minutes late, which told her something. A man who cared about impressions would have been early. Calloway Vane pulled up in a wagon that had seen better years, drawn by a horse that looked like it had too. He was tall enough that climbing down from the seat looked like unfolding rather than descending. Dark coat, dark hat, jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He looked at her the way you'd look at a piece of equipment you'd ordered from a catalog, wondering if it would hold up to the work. "Miss Brennan." "Not a question, Mr. Vane." Also not a question. He picked up her carpetbag without asking and put it in the wagon bed. Then he stood by the passenger side and waited. Saoirse climbed up herself. She didn't need help and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. They drove out of Coldwater Flats without exchanging another word, which suited her fine. She watched the town thin out and disappear behind them, replaced by frozen fields and then stands of spruce that blocked the sky. The road was rutted from the last hard freeze. Every jolt went straight up through the seat into her spine. She thought about what she'd left behind in Toronto. The boarding house on Bathurst where she'd lived for 2 years. The job at the linen factory that had paid just enough to keep her from starving and not enough to keep her from lying awake worrying about it. Her mother had died in the spring, her father 3 years before that, and the cousin who'd offered her a temporary roof had made it clear. In the polite, grinding way of people who think kindness means not saying the hard thing directly, that temporary had expired. She was 28 years old. She had $2.40 and a broken carpetbag and a letter from a stranger who described himself entirely in terms of what he did not offer. When the agency had shown her the advertisement, she'd read it 3 times looking for the part where it turned sinister. Must be capable of hard work. Must not expect comforts. Must understand this arrangement is practical in nature. 2 children, ages 7 and 5. Wife deceased 14 months prior. Property in the Coldwater Flats district of Northern Ontario. 40 acres, mixed farming and some cattle. The agency woman had watched her read it and said, "He's not warm, I'll tell you that plainly. But he's not unkind either, from what we can determine. He just needs someone capable." Saoirse had thought, "I need somewhere to be. That might be enough to start with." Now rattling along a frozen road toward a farm she'd never seen, she revised that slightly. She needed somewhere to be. She needed it badly enough to make this work regardless of what she found at the other end. The farmhouse appeared around a bend in the road, sitting back from a stand of birch trees, with smoke rising from one chimney. It was bigger than she'd expected, 2 stories, a long porch across the front, but the kind of big that came from need rather than ambition. Someone had added rooms as the need arose, and the addition showed. A barn behind it, a smaller outbuilding, fence lines running out in different directions across the white fields. 2 small figures stood on the porch. Calloway had stopped the wagon at the fence gate. He didn't say anything about the children, just got down and started unhitching the horse, leaving Saoirse to climb out on her own, and walk to the house herself, which she did. The older one was a girl, 7 years old, with her father's dark coloring and an expression of careful assessment that looked too adult for her voice. The younger was a boy, 5, who was doing his level best to appear uninterested while clearly watching her with everything he had. "I'm Saoirse," she said. "That's a strange name," the girl said. "It's Irish. It means freedom." The girl considered this. "I'm Abigail. Everyone calls me Abby. He's Otto. He doesn't talk much when he's nervous." "I don't talk when I'm nervous either," Saoirse said. "So we have that in common." Otto looked at her properly for the first time. Then he looked away again, but one corner of his mouth had moved. It wasn't much, but it was something. The wedding happened 4 days later at the county office in Coldwater Flats, with the clerk and a woman from the adjoining office brought in as witness. It took 11 minutes. Saoirse wore her better dress, which wasn't saying much, and Calloway wore the same dark coat he'd picked her up in. He didn't look at her during the ceremony except when required to, which was once when he spoke the words. He had gray eyes. She noticed that during the one look, cold as river ice in March, but not cruel, just closed. Afterward, he paid off a debt at the feed store and bought a small bag of penny candy that he gave to Abby and Otto without comment. It was the first gesture toward softness Saoirse had seen from him, and she filed it away carefully. The arrangement was clear. She had the upstairs room at the far end of the hall. He had the one near the stairs. The house needed running. The children needed tending. There was cooking and washing and mending and whatever else the farm required of her hands, which turned out to be considerable. In exchange, she had a roof, food, and a legal name that no one could take from her. She told herself she'd been in worse situations. She almost believed it. The farm was called Vane's Crossing, which struck her as a grimly appropriate name for a place that felt like every direction was a threshold to something hard. Calloway worked from before light until after dark most days, coming inside briefly for meals and then disappearing again. He spoke in practical sentences. The weather's turning. Left fences down again. There's a heifer ready to drop. Stay away stiff from the east pasture. He did not ask how she was finding things, whether she was comfortable, what she'd thought of the life she'd left behind to come here. She did not volunteer that information either. What she did instead was learn the house, where the floorboards creaked and which door stuck when the cold settled into the frame, how much wood the kitchen stove needed to hold heat through the night, the particular way the water pump needed to be coaxed in the morning before it would cooperate. She watched how Calloway moved through the space and noted what he did without thinking, because things done without thinking were usually important. Abby showed her around the first day with the earnest thoroughness of someone who'd been waiting for a responsible adult to inform. This is where Mama kept the sewing basket. Papa doesn't know where anything is in the kitchen. Otto's afraid of the dark, but he won't say so. The chickens don't like strangers, but they'll get used to you if you don't rush them. Saoirse listened to all of it carefully. It was the most useful orientation she'd ever received. Otto warmed up to her on the 5th day, without warning or preamble. He appeared in the kitchen while she was making bread, and simply climbed onto the stool beside the work table and watched. She didn't make a fuss of it. She just handed him a small piece of dough to work with his hands, and he took it, and they worked in companionable silence for an hour. After that, he was frequently where she was. She didn't tell Calloway this. She suspected he knew anyway. He didn't say anything, which she was coming to understand was often his way of registering something he didn't have words for. The first real conversation they had was about the barn roof. She'd noticed it leaking when she'd gone out to collect eggs. Not a small leak, a significant one. Water staining the wood in 3 places, the kind of damage that would compound through the winter. She'd mentioned it at supper without thinking, not as a complaint, just as a fact she thought he'd want to know. He'd looked at her then. Not the assessing look from the station, something different. I know about it, he said. All right, there's no money for lumber until spring. Saoirse had thought about this while she washed the supper dishes. Then she'd said, my father patched a roof once using oilcloth and pine pitch. It's not permanent, but it holds. Another silence. Then, where'd he get oilcloth? Bought a damaged bolt cheap at a dry goods store, the kind they sell at a discount because it's irregular. Calloway had gotten up from the table and put on his coat and gone out. She'd assumed the conversation was over. In the morning, there was a bolt of irregular oilcloth on the kitchen table, and Calloway was already on the barn roof. She'd climbed up and helped him, which he hadn't asked for and hadn't refused. They worked in the particular silence of 2 people doing a practical thing together, passing tools and holding material and moving around each other with increasing efficiency as the hours passed. By midday, the leak was patched, not permanently, but held. When they climbed down, Calloway said, that was your father's idea. Yes, he was practical, he was. A pause that wasn't quite the same as his usual silences, which were flat and ended conversations. This one had something in it she couldn't name. Mine was too, he said finally. Didn't talk much either. He walked back to the barn to check on the cattle, and Saoirse stood in the cold yard and thought, that's more than I expected. It would have to be enough. Winter deepened. Saoirse found a rhythm, and the rhythm found her. She was up before the children, had the stove hot and porridge on, before Calloway came in from the first morning checks. She kept the house in a state of functioning order. Not the pristine managed distance of a servant, but the comfortable efficiency of someone who understood what a place needed and provided it without ceremony. The children went to the schoolhouse in Coldwater Flats 3 days a week. And on the days they were home, she taught them things the school didn't. How to read weather, how to do sums in their heads, how to mend a hem and check a harness, and identify which plants meant water was nearby. Abi absorbed everything and immediately deployed it. Otto absorbed everything and kept it quiet inside himself until it was needed. Saoirse recognized them both. She'd been a different one at 7, and another one at 5, depending on the year. The hardest evenings were the ones after the children had gone to bed, and she and Calloway sat in the kitchen in the particular silence of two strangers who had signed legal documents binding themselves to each other's proximity without understanding what that would cost them. He read, she mended or wrote letters. Neither of them spoke much, but she noticed that he stopped taking his book to his room after the first few weeks, that he stayed at the kitchen table instead, which held the warmth longer than any other room in the house. She did not make anything of it. She noted it. The trouble arrived in February, which was when trouble in that country generally arrived, when the cold had worn everything down to its essential structure and there was nowhere left to hide from hard things. It came in the form of a man named Douglas Schofield. Saoirse recognized the name from a letter that had come the previous month, which Calloway had read and then folded and put in his coat pocket without comment. She'd seen his jaw set when he read it, the particular tension that meant something unwelcome. She hadn't asked. It wasn't her place, she told herself. They were not that kind of married. But then Schofield arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, in a sleigh that cost more than the farm likely had in it, with two men behind him who had the blank, watchful look of people being paid to seem larger than their actual purpose. Saoirse was the one who answered the door. Schofield was in his 50s, well-fed in the way of men who have spent their lives making other people's scarcity work for them. He had a pleasant smile and eyes that were doing calculations behind it. Mrs. Vane, he said, as though the name surprised him pleasantly. I wasn't aware Calloway had remarried. He didn't mention it. He doesn't mention much, Saoirse said. What can I do for you, Mr. Schofield? I'm here to speak with your husband on a business matter. Nothing to concern yourself about. Everything about the way he said it was designed to make her retreat, to confirm herself as a domestic presence and clear the field for the real conversation. She recognized the move. She'd seen it done 100 times by different men in different contexts, always with the same underlying message. You are furniture, please stop pretending otherwise. He's in the east barn, she said. I'll take you. She didn't give him time to redirect, just pulled on her coat and walked out, leaving him to follow. Calloway was checking on a calf that had come early and fragile when they arrived. He looked up and saw Schofield, and his face went very still in the way she was coming to understand, meant he was working to keep something out of it. Schofield, Calloway, I see you have a wife now. I do, convenient timing. Schofield's smile didn't shift. Given the current situation with the note, Saoirse had positioned herself just inside the barn door. Neither man was paying attention to her, which suited her exactly. I'll ask my wife to give us a moment, Calloway started. She can stay, Saoirse said. Both men looked at her. Calloway's expression was unreadable. Schofield slid through surprise into something that might have been amusement if you didn't look closely enough to see the edge beneath it. As you like, Schofield said. It concerns the property anyway. Both of you, then. He explained with the calm of a man delivering information he's already arranged to his advantage, that Calloway held a debt against the farm. 42 acres, the barn, the cattle, taken out after his wife's illness had bankrupted what small savings they'd had. The note was held by a company called Northern Land Consolidated, which had recently acquired it from the original lender. The terms haven't changed, Schofield said, but the timeline has. We're calling the note in the spring, March 15th. Calloway said, that's 8 weeks. It is. There's no way to raise that sum in 8 weeks. No, Schofield agreed pleasantly. There isn't, which is why I've come with an alternative. Northern Land is prepared to purchase the property outright at fair market value and offer you a generous period to vacate. You'd walk away with something rather than nothing, which is the other option. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up, lifting snow off the roof in white sheets. Saoirse watched Calloway's face. She saw something moving through it that she recognized because she'd felt it herself, in that boarding house room in Toronto, in the factory, in the cousin's house where she'd slept on a cot in the pantry. The particular horror of being handed a choice that isn't a choice, dressed up in the language of reasonableness. How long have you been planning this? Calloway asked. Schofield's smile stayed exactly where it was. We've been watching the situation, yes? We do that with distressed property and the other farms along the creek. A pause. Small but real. We have interests in the region, Schofield said carefully. You're buying the water access, Calloway said. That's what this is. The creek that runs through this property and the Macaulay land and the Trent operation. You control those 3 properties. You control the water for a quarter of the district. Schofield's smile became something cooler. That's a creative interpretation. It's a correct one. I'd encourage you to speak with a lawyer before making accusations, Calloway. It tends to be expensive for the person making them. He glanced at Saoirse, particularly when there are children involved and a new wife to consider. It was a threat. Dressed in concern, but a threat. Saoirse said very evenly, March 15th. Schofield looked at her. That's the date you named, she said. We heard you. Is there anything else? A pause in which she could feel him reevaluating. She'd seen that happen before, too. The moment when someone who expected furniture realized they'd been talking to a person instead. That's all, he said. Then I think my husband has work to finish. I'll show you out. She walked him back to his sleigh in the same tone she'd walked him to the barn, neither unfriendly nor inviting, and stood in the yard while he and his men drove away. Then she went back inside and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at nothing. Calloway came in from the barn 20 minutes later. He washed his hands at the pump without speaking. She put a mug of tea in front of him. He sat down, looked at it, then said without looking at her, You didn't have to stay. I know. I don't need someone to fight my battles. I wasn't fighting anything. I was listening. Saoirse sat down across from him. The creek? Tell me what I don't already know. Another of those silences. Longer this time. There's an underground spring feeds into the creek on the west side of this property, he said finally. Comes up from somewhere deep, never freezes, never dries up. I've had it my whole life. My father had it before me. It's what makes this land worth farming through drought years when everything else is cracked earth, and Schofield knows about it. He's known for a year. Sent me a purchase offer last February that I refused. Thought that was the end of it. A pause. It wasn't the end of it. He bought your debt instead, through 3 different companies, so it wasn't obvious until it was too late to do much about it. Calloway's hands were flat on the table, the way she'd noticed they got when he was containing something. I took that loan to pay for Margaret's treatment. The last 4 months of it. The good doctors, the ones in Toronto who might have. He stopped. Saoirse did not fill the silence. She understood some silences needed to be sat through rather than smoothed over. It didn't help, he said finally. She died anyway. And I've been carrying the debt since. What does the spring connect to, she asked. Not because she was redirecting. Because she needed to know. He looked at her properly then, the way he had on the barn roof, that look that wasn't assessing anymore but something less defined. Runs under the 3 properties along the creek. Comes up twice more, once on the Macaulay farm, once on the Trent land. All 3 of us draw from it. It's why those farms have survived the dry years when others haven't. And if Schofield owns all 3, he controls who stays and who doesn't in this district. Water out here isn't a luxury. It's everything. Saoirse thought about the boarding house in Toronto, about watching the world organize itself around who had resources and who was dependent on the people who had them. She had been dependent her whole life on her father's work, her mother's careful management, then on employers and landladies and cousins. She understood with visceral clarity what it felt like to have your survival held in someone else's hand and have them squeeze, just slightly, just enough so you remembered it was there. He's going to do the same thing to this valley that he's already decided to do to you, she said. Buy debt, call notes, sell the land as one package to some Eastern company that'll turn the water into a business instead of a commons. Calloway said nothing, which meant yes. Then we have 8 weeks, Saoirse said. 8 weeks to raise money I don't have. 8 weeks to find a different way. She stood and went to the counter and came back with paper and a pencil she'd kept in the kitchen for writing grocery lists. The spring. You said it comes up on Macaulay's land and on the Trent property. Yes. Do they know Schofield is coming for them too? A pause. Probably not. Then that's where we start. She went to see Nora Macaulay the next morning, driving herself in the smaller wagon because Calloway had looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely decode and said he needed to do the morning checks. She drove through cold that felt personal and arrived at a farmhouse that looked like it was being kept standing through will alone. Nora Macaulay was 61 years old, had been working her land since before the war, and received Saoirse's explanation about Schofield and the spring with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be calm in the face of catastrophe, because the other option doesn't help. I thought something was off when my credit at the Coldwater store went strange in November, she said. The owner started acting peculiar about my tab. Schofield probably has interests there too, Saoirse said. He's applying pressure everywhere he can. What's your husband planning to do? We're working on that. She met Nora's eyes steadily. What I'm asking is whether you'd stand with us if we found a way to fight this. The older woman studied her for a long moment. You haven't been out here long. 6 weeks. But you married into this fight. I married into this district. The fight was already here. Saoirse folded her hands in her lap. My mother used to say that the only things worth doing were the ones that mattered to more people than just yourself. This matters to everyone in the Creek Valley. Nora Macaulay made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an acknowledgement. Your mother sounds like she was a sensible woman. She was. All right, Nora said. I'll stand. What do we need to do? Gilbert Trent was harder. He was a younger man in his 30s, recently arrived from Manitoba with the cautious optimism of someone who had come somewhere new, specifically to avoid other people's problems. The idea that other people's problems had followed him anyway sat badly. I don't know these people, he said. I don't have any obligation to fight someone else's battle. The spring on your property, Saoirse said. You know it doesn't freeze? That's why I bought this land. If Schofield gets the other two properties, he controls access to the water table that feeds it. Legally, you might still have the spring, but you won't have the water pressure. It'll dry up or diminish enough to be useless. She paused. I'm not asking you to do anything for us. I'm telling you that your interest and ours are the same interest. What you decide to do with that is up to you. Gilbert Trent looked at her for a long time. What do you need from me? He said finally. The plan that came together over the following 2 weeks was Saoirse's in its shape, though she borrowed pieces from everywhere. Calloway knew the land law. Nora knew the district history. Gilbert, it turned out, had spent a year studying business before abandoning it to come farm, and understood the structure of how Northern Land Consolidated had organized itself well enough to identify the seams in it. And Saoirse knew people. She'd spent her life watching how things were done by people with power from the outside, with the particular sharp attention of someone who needs to understand the system, because they can't afford not to. She knew how to present information so it couldn't be dismissed. She knew when to be quiet and when to be visible. She knew that the only real weapon ordinary people had against organized wealth was other ordinary people. Organized. She started writing letters, not to lawyers she couldn't afford, not to officials who'd be sympathetic at best and useless, to families across the district, to the women who came to the church auxiliary Nora had told her about, to the man who ran the small newspaper in Coldwater Flats, a young man named Bertram Cross, who had the hungry look of someone with more ambition than material to print. Calloway watched all of this with something she could feel rather than see. He didn't interfere. He didn't help, not directly, not at first. He came in for meals and ate them, and occasionally said something practical about what she was planning. Once he pointed out a legal error in a letter she was drafting that would have weakened her argument. She corrected it. He didn't comment on the correction, but he was watching. One evening, 3 weeks after Schofield's visit, she was at the kitchen table surrounded by papers when she heard him come in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway longer than usual. Then he came and sat down across from her. The county land records, he said. Thompson and Coldwater has them. He owes me a favor. Saoirse looked up. If Schofield's been acquiring debt through multiple companies, there'll be a paper trail in the ownership transfers. Might be irregularities, things that look different when you know what to look for. Calloway's voice was careful, stripped of inflection in the way she'd noticed, meant he was keeping something out of it. I was going to look into it myself before, when it was just my problem. But I didn't get there in time. You were managing the farm and 2 children alone, Saoirse said. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. It's different. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I should have told you sooner, about the full extent of it. Yes, she said. You should have. Not forgiving, not reproaching. Just honest, which was the only way she knew how to be with him. I wasn't sure it was your fight, he said. I live here, Saoirse said. My name is on a document that says this is my home. Abby and Otto are. She stopped because what she'd been about to say surprised her. She hadn't planned to say it. They matter to me, she said instead, more carefully. This place matters to me. That's not what I expected, but it's true. The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. She couldn't explain exactly how. Just that something had shifted in the room, the way weather shifted when the pressure changed. All right, Calloway said finally. He pulled the nearest paper toward him and read what she'd written. Then he picked up her pencil without asking and made a note in the margin. Not a correction, an addition. They worked at the kitchen table until past midnight. Bertram Cross ran the story in the Coldwater Flats Register on a Thursday in early March, 2 weeks before Schofield's deadline. It was detailed, careful, sourced with property records and land transfers, and the testimonies of Nora Macaulay and Gilbert Trent, and 4 other families who had come forward once they understood what was happening. Calloway had provided the legal analysis. Saoirse had written the plain language version that translated what the documents meant into terms anyone could understand. The irregularities Calloway had found in the land records were significant. 3 of the debt transfers had been registered with a single day's gap that violated territorial recording requirements. Not a large gap, not the kind of thing you'd notice unless you were looking, but real and documented and legally meaningful. Schofield arrived at the farm that same Thursday, and this time he didn't come alone. He came with a lawyer. Saoirse answered the door. "Mrs. Vane," Schofield said. His pleasant smile was gone. In its place was something harder and more honest. "I assume you're responsible for this." He held up a copy of the register. "My husband and I provided information. Mr. Cross wrote the article. You've made serious allegations. We've presented documented records," Saoirse said. "The allegations make themselves." The lawyer, a thin man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, was watching this exchange with the expression of someone recalculating. "I want to speak with your husband." "You're speaking with me." A pause. "Mrs. Vane." "My husband is finishing the morning work. 40 acres doesn't stop needing attention because we have visitors." She stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation, not quite a refusal. "You're welcome to come in and wait, or you can say what you came to say to me." Schofield looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through it. She was not what he'd expected. He'd expected probably a woman who'd signed documents and made a practical arrangement, and had no real stake in what happened to the land. He hadn't expected someone who'd spent 3 weeks learning every seam in his operation. She knew this look. She'd seen it on Calloway's face that first day on the barn roof, when he'd realized the woman he'd hired to run his house was instead doing something else. "Those recording irregularities," Schofield said finally, "they can be contested. They can be," Saoirse agreed. "That would involve a public hearing, which would involve all the documentation we've already provided to the register being entered into county record, and the testimony of 12 families in the district who've agreed to appear." She paused. "It would also involve questions about how Northern Land Consolidated came to hold notes on 17 properties across 4 districts, which is what Mr. Cross is currently looking into for his next piece." The lawyer put his hand on Schofield's arm. A small gesture. Schofield went still. "What do you want?" Schofield asked. His voice had changed, still controlled but differently controlled. The control of someone who has reached the edge of his leverage and is now standing on the other side of it. "The same thing anyone wants," Saoirse said, "to live on our land and work it in peace. We want the note restructured to original terms with the original lender. We want the other notes in this district reviewed for the same irregularities, and any with the same issues corrected. And we want to do this quietly, without further proceedings, which costs everyone less than the alternative." "That's not unreasonable," the lawyer said. He said it to Schofield, not to her, but he was right. Calloway came in from the barn an hour later to find Schofield's sleigh gone and Saoirse at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and an expression he couldn't read. "What happened?" he asked. She told him. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and listened to the whole thing. Then he sat down across from her, which he'd been doing more often lately. The kitchen table had started to feel like common ground rather than 2 separate people occupying the same space. "You gave him a way out," Calloway said. "Yes, most people would have pushed for more. Most people haven't spent 28 years watching what happens when you back someone into a corner with nowhere to go," Saoirse said. "Give them a way out. Make it the easier choice. That's how you actually get what you need." He looked at her for a long moment. The way he'd been looking at her more and more, she'd noticed, not assessing. Something she didn't have a clean word for. "The children like you," he said. It came out like a practical statement, but it wasn't. She could hear the difference. "I like them," she said. "That was." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know what I was doing, putting that advertisement out. I needed someone capable, and I found you, and I thought that was the end of it. Just practicality." His hands were flat on the table, that containing gesture. It stopped feeling like just practicality. Saoirse looked at him. When? Barn roof. She thought about that. She'd been working alongside him in the cold, passing tools, moving without being asked, 2 hours of practical companionship. She hadn't thought of it as a turning point, but she thought of it now, differently. "You didn't say anything," she said. "No, I didn't know how." He seemed to consider the word carefully. "I know how to work. I don't always know how to say things. I noticed," Saoirse said, not unkindly. "Does that?" He stopped again, collected himself. "Does that bother you?" She thought about the cousin's pantry, and the factory floor, and the boarding house room, and all the places she'd been practical in because she had to be. She thought about the first time Otto had appeared in her kitchen and climbed onto the stool without asking, and she'd felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. "What bothers me," she said carefully, "is not knowing where I stand. I can work with difficult. I can work with quiet. I can't work with not knowing if I'm a hired hand or something else. Calloway was quiet for a moment that was neither long nor short but felt weighted. You're my wife, he said. I mean it to be something real. If that's something you can. Yes, she said, before he could finish the sentence, because she didn't need to hear the rest of it. Yes, that's something I can. The kitchen was warm, the way it always was when the stove had been going long enough. Outside, wind came and went against the window. Saoirse wrapped her hands around her mug and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she was sitting in a place that was actually hers. The note was restructured in late March, on the original terms, with the original interest rate. The transfer irregularities were quietly corrected across 4 properties in the district. Northern Land Consolidated withdrew its offers on all 3 Creek Valley farms. Bertram Cross ran a follow-up piece that was, if anything, more detailed than the first, and which caused enough scrutiny of Northern Land's other operations in the territory that Schofield's company spent the following year dealing with inquiries rather than acquisitions. None of it was dramatic in the way of stories that get told afterward. There was no single confrontation, no moment of collapse. Just the patient, grinding work of people who understood their situation well enough to refuse the terms being offered to them, and who were stubborn enough to find different terms instead. Nora Macaulay planted her spring crop the first week of April, which she'd done every year for 30 years and intended to keep doing. Gilbert Trent expanded his cattle operation and, by his own accounting, stopped being cautious about other people's problems. At Vane's Crossing, Abby started teaching Otto to read, which Otto pretended to resist and actually welcomed, as was his way with most things. Calloway fixed the porch step that had been loose since November without Saoirse having to ask, which she considered a significant development. She started teaching the 3 families nearest to them on days the weather allowed, because she'd been a teacher in a previous iteration of her life, and old habits came back when you gave them room. One evening in May, with the fields showing the first real green of the year and the light lasting long enough to eat supper by, Calloway came and sat beside her on the porch steps instead of across from her at the table. Abby and Otto were somewhere in the near field, audible if not visible. I was thinking, he said. Unusual, she said, which made him make the sound that was his version of a laugh, something she'd been drawing out of him with increasing frequency. I was thinking I didn't write that letter well. The advertisement must be capable of hard work, must not expect comforts. He said it with a flatness that was almost self-mocking. I was describing someone to do tasks. I wasn't describing anything real. No, Saoirse agreed. You weren't. I don't know how to do that. Describe things that are real. He was quiet for a moment. But I know what's real when it's there. Saoirse looked out at the field where she could hear Abby explaining something to Otto with great seriousness. The spring was running, somewhere under the ground beneath them, cold and clear and permanent, finding its way through the dark earth to the surface. Me too, she said. That was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough, no more, and no less than what the moment could hold, and that was its own kind of rightness. After a life spent in places where nothing quite fit, she stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, not anymore, because she had chosen this. Because there was a difference between a place you end up and a place you decide on, and Vane's Crossing had moved, somewhere between a barn roof and a kitchen table and a porch step in May, from the first kind to the second. The land needed working. The children needed steady. The man beside her was slowly, painstakingly learning the language of saying things out loud. And Saoirse Brennan Vane, who had come north with $2.40 and a broken carpetbag and no particular hope, had found the one thing she'd never thought to put on a list of what she needed. Something worth staying for.